Hey everyone, my name is Kretz, but you don't have to see my face today because we're gonna be in the Lightroom inspecting the picture quality from the lens, which I reviewed some time ago. Just go watch that review. I'll probably put a link in the corner to the YouTube card. This is a very nice vintage manual only lens, 135mm, and with a wide maximum aperture of f2.8. This is a full frame, this is a vintage lens made probably in the 70s, so just go watch the full review of it in my first video, and in my second video I've inspected a couple of adapters for this lens from M42 mount, which it has originally, to Canon EF mount, because I'm using the Canon cameras, so we're gonna be dealing with them. And there are some issues with the adapters, so you better inspect this video of mine to know how to use it and which adapters to buy. And now here we are at the Lightroom and we see the pictures. We're going to be testing this lens on a full frame camera and also on a crop sensor, APS-C sized sensor camera. But you really better use this lens with the full frame camera because it was on purpose created for the film, for 35mm film. At those times there were no digital photography at those times, so this is originally made for full frame. And today this is what we're doing. This is the first collection of my pictures. This is from my 5D Classic, and you really want to use some decent and cheap full frame camera like this, like original EOS 5D Mark 1 or 5D Classic, because it's really cheap and it is as cheap as this lens. So this is a nice pair. If you have money for expensive camera, you better be looking into some more decent lenses. But this is a cheap lens and this is a cheap body, and the body is absolutely perfect and beautiful. As you know, 5D Classic, it is, as the name suggests, this is a classic in the photography, in digital photography today. So let's dig into the pictures. We'll go to the Develop tab and see for the information in here. And you see, concerning the issue that I covered in my video about the adapters, I couldn't use the programmable, the nice adapter with this lens, and I explained it in that video. So I only had the shutter speed, the real shutter speed, and ISO, because they are determined by the camera itself. So these are the real numbers. But about the f-stop, the aperture, and the focal length, these are totally, fail, because the adapter wouldn't convey the information to camera. So this is definitely not a 50mm, this is 135mm. And the aperture always stays the same. It doesn't show you no matter what is going on, but I'll tell you what aperture each shot is. So just don't pay attention to this information. And of course, for all the pictures, I just selected them and I brought the sharpness, the default sharpness and noise reduction to 0, just to get, the clean test. And I've made the auto white balance auto. And in some shots, I had to compensate the exposure for, like, let's say like in here, for half a stop, because these adapters, the cheapest adapter that I used here could sometimes miss with the exposure. And considering that 5D Classic doesn't have auto ISO at all, and you do all your settings manually, absolutely all your settings, I had to just compensate a little bit with the exposure compensation here in Lightroom. So, alright, let's dig into picture quality. We have here the sets of fourth. As you see, each shot, each composition is made in fourth for pictures. And this is because I use the different apertures, of course. And this is, as I told previously, this is a BOKEH Monster. So this is a lens with a huge focal length, not huge, but quite big, telephoto lens with wide maximum aperture. So it gives really nice and blurry background, as you can see here. And that's what we are intended to use this lens for. And therefore, I didn't test this lens at f11 or f16. And as I told you previously, this lens only can change the aperture at in full stops. So why the 4 shots? Because the first one is to 8, second is f4, the third is f5-6, and the fourth is the at f8, which is probably the most closed aperture which you want to use with this lens, because it's not really intended. It's more a portrait lens or a product photography lens. So, all right, finally, let's start. Let's see, this is a nice image, but we already see that it's a little bit soft. And if we zoom it 1:1, we can really see that it's ghosty and it is soft at f2.8. Not a very good picture quality. You see the focus is probably in this area at this shot. This is a place of focus, but it is still not so very sharp. And we see in the corners the same, it is ghosty, but it's really difficult to tell because you don't see where the exact focus point is. And especially with the branches at the windy day, each millimeter can really play its role. So, all right, let's go further. We see it at f4. Zoom 1:1. We definitely see much better sharpness in here. The sharpness is improved, really. And in the corners too, but they are still not very good. Let's see at f5.6. And at 5.6, the sharpness is much better. You see, this branch, it's much sharper. And the colors are fine. The sharpness is nice. Let's go to f8. And here the sharpness is very good. It's probably not perfect, but it's really very good. And you still have a huge blurred background. By the way, I must say a few words about the background. Let me just click through them. You see f2.8, f4, f5.6 and f8. Just pay attention to the background. It's nice and smooth. I noticed that on all vintage lenses the background blur is mostly nice and smooth. It's not so nervous like on, I must say, contemporary Canon 50mm lenses. The background blur, I mean the cheap lenses, of course. I'm not meaning the modern RF lenses, which might be really good, but the lenses that regular people like me, ordinary people, use, like f1.8 or f1.4. So on those lenses, the background blur is quite nervous most of the times, but on the vintage lenses, this is really good. And on this particular lens, the background blur is special. It's not curly or something like on some Soviet lenses and stuff, but you can see it's even not like blurred, but it looks smudgy, like the paint, you know, washed with a brush or with a finger, just fingertips over the painting. You see, it really looks like paint to me. And this is nice, and it might be really good for portraits. And even that this lens is a little bit on the soft side, you see at f2.8, this can really be preferable for portraits, just to smooth that skin out and just to get rid of some skin defects. This might be useful. I probably might be testing it with a real person portraits sometime. Alright, let's go further. Just a different composition to see what it can do on the landscape. This is at f2.8, the same story, a little bit soft and ghosty. Nothing special here. We go to f4. Better sharpness, but still not really good. Despite this, I must say, at this scale, at full scale, it's really usable. Even at f2.8, for social nets, for Facebook, for Instagram, this would be just enough. So just the lens works, and that's all what matters. But at f5.6, the sharpness is really decent. You see, even in the corners, it's a little bit worse, but it's still good. At 5.6, it's really good. Not perfect, but good. And at f8, in the center of the image, it's almost perfect. Really good, in my opinion. And what about the corners? Corners, you know, it's hard to discuss because this is a 3D image, so this is a longer distance than the center subject. So I must say at 5.6 and f8 the image is really good. And this is a really long telephoto shot from the upper floor. This is just few kilometers away from the point of shooting, so you can see really the perspective. And at f2.8 it's of course a little bit smudgy and soft, as we already seen. And at f4 there is more contrast to the picture, more sharpness. Really, it's really better, and it's getting better and better as you stop the aperture down. And at 5.6 this is really decent. And I'm not sure where the focus is. I believe the focus is somewhere here on this building. Yeah, right, this looks like being in focus, and where it's in focus it's quite sharp really. And this is a long telephoto, so just be aware of the air waves and heat and something like that. It may play its role. And let's see, at f8 it must be really, really sharp. Great picture quality. Of course a little bit of ghosting and shakiness in the corner, but it's okay for portrait lens. It always works. And this is a lens of, you know, 20-30 bucks. You can probably purchase it for, I don't know how much, 25 US dollars. So for this price, I believe this is quite a nice lens. Let's get back to some kind of a portraiture test. The same story. Soft at f2.8, sharper at f4, much better at f5.6. Let it load. Yeah. But this looks not perfect, but that's because the sharpness, the focusing point is probably somewhere here on this wood. Yeah, and at f8 this is good, really, really good. But as you see, the background blur here and the background blur at f2.8, they differ greatly. So the last set is really a portrait style picture, soft at 2.8, but look how nice really the background blur looks. There's not enough contrast. I could probably add a little bit of contrast here, like this. Much more punchy. And if we add a little bit of clarity and something, so if you edit the picture, it might be looking fine. But the background blur is really something special, as I told you. It's just like a paint, painted with fingers over the paper or something like that. And at a 4, let's see closer, it is sharper. 5.6, let it load, much sharper. You see, this is quite sharp, and this is a branch on a windy day, so it's really hard to nail focus, especially that this is a fully manual lens we're talking about. And at f8, this is really, really good. And this is just a couple of additional shots. I don't know which aperture is this. I believe it's something like f4 or f5.6. I'm not sure. It's just the crow I just did. And this picture, you see the background blur is not so beautiful, and it looks like the artificial blur on some of contemporary smartphones. But what I would like to tell you and show you is really interesting. If you just add a little bit of extra sharpness, artificial post-processing sharpness. For example, my Lightroom automatically, if I double click here, it gives me 40 on the sharpening. And let's see what we're getting. Let's get back to the first picture at f2.8 and see how really good this picture becomes. It's really nice and sharp. Probably at 1:1 you can see some artifacts here from the artificial sharpening, but this is really much, much sharper. Just adding sharpness in the Lightroom or any other editor of your choice, this is really good. And this is at f2.8. You can already get a really nice and pretty sharp. At least for the portrait, it's going to be sharp enough. And of course, if you stop down at f4, for portraits at f4, it's almost already sharp enough. I mean, almost perfect. And of course at 5.6 and f8 it's gonna be absolutely sharp. Let's see. This is at f5.6 with a little bit of extra sharpening, and at f8 this is gonna be, I believe, razor sharp. You see, this is really razor sharp. Let's bring back the sharpness. You see, this is the original f8, and just by double clicking to the default sharpening, this is good. And this, to my eye, this does not look as artificial sharpening. It all looks absolutely natural to me, and this is one-to-one magnification. So probably at, you know, full scale you will never see the difference. And at full scale and f2.8, I believe this is gonna be, there's not enough contrast. Let's see, we add a little bit of extra contrast and the sharpening, the default sharpening. So this is looking really nice. So this lens, you can use it on a full frame camera even at f2.8, and especially at f4 it's going to be probably the best, you know, difference between the background blur and the sharpness. This is going to be the sweet spot at f4, but you can even use it at f2.8, just adding a little bit of extra sharpening in post-processing. So that's our results for the full frame camera. Alright, I can't get enough. Let's see this f2.8 with sharpening. Here you can see it, really. And this picture, this is definitely some of artificial sharpening. But at f4, it is way, way better, way better. And this is one-to-one. You see, at full scale, this is beautiful. And f5.6 and f8, it's going to be just stunning. With just, you see, razor sharp, just with additional sharpening. All right, this is the full frame test. Now we're getting to the APS-C test, which I did on my Canon 70D. This is quite an old camera as well, with 20 megapixels. So that is a harder task for the lens. First, because it's 20 megapixels instead of 12 in Canon 5D Mark I. And the APS-C sensor just uses the center portion of the lens, though, so it's kind of like a magnified, and those old lenses were not supposed to be, you know, used with just the center of the lens, so it's going to be quite harder for the lens to deliver the details. But let's see what we can get. And you should consider that on the APS-C sensor, this is going to be not 135mm. The focal length is going to be equivalent. Focal length is going to be 216 millimeters. So that's a higher magnification. And the maximum aperture of f2.8 is going to give f4.5 depth of field, equivalent to the full frame. So this is looking like 216 f4.5 on a full frame. And this is a 135 f2.8 right now. Let's see. This is, let's see this size. Right, this is 20 megapixel as you see here. Let's get back. And the same story, you see that the focal length is, you know, not correct. It's showing this weird number, and it always shows the f1.4, while this is the same story. These all pictures are 2.8, f4, f5.6, and f8. And the ISO and shutter speed are correct. Alright, so at f2.8 the same story, but I'm not sure. It might be looking even a little bit sharper than on a full frame. But I don't know. And of course the background is a little bit blurred, but this is not a shiny, bright day, so it's hard to describe. Alright, at f4 we already see that this is much more contrasty in sharpening. Sharpening is at 0. Alright. Comparing to f2.8, f4 already has more contrast and more sharpness. So it's the same story as with the full frame basically. Alright, let's go to 5.6. Much more sharpness, so no wonder it's really the same story. This is more noise because there is not so much light on that day, and at f8 You know, at full scale, these pictures starting from f5.6 really look nice. And at f2.8, it's a little bit on the soft and ghosty side. All right, this is much more interesting. This is kind of like a product or a portrait photography shot. Low contrast, right away we see, but very, very out of focus background, which is, you know, that's why it is a bokeh monster. And this is a really close focusing distance. I can't remember exactly, but this is might be the closest, the maximum, minimum, I'm sorry, the minimum focusing distance. It might be the minimum, which is around 1.5 meters. All right, let's see. The center sharpness is absent today. You know, there is no really sharpness in the center, and it is ghosty and soft, but there is a nice amount of background blur. Next image, f4. More sharpness, more contrast, as expected, and a lot of noise because not enough light, and I had to bump my ISO, and probably not even myself, but the camera bumped its ISO because it can do that. Unlike Canon 5D, 70D has auto ISO. f5.6, much more sharpness, of course, and f8 definitely, you know, bigger depth of field, so the background is not so out of focus, but the subject is really, really sharp. Now, another set, probably the same story. And this is a really high ISO, so, okay, sharper at 4, sharper at 5.6, and even sharper at f8. So it's absolutely the same story. But what I've noticed in these subjects like this, in picture like this, you already see this is quite decent. You see, it's a little bit softer here and here, but overall image is looking nice. And if you stop down the aperture, of course it's getting sharper, as it must be, but you don't really notice it that much. So it really depends on the composition. So f8 is definitely sharper, but you also see it because there's much more noise. But if we compare the first and the last picture, you can even prefer the f2.8 picture. It is softer, but it is much more artistically pleasing to my eye, you see? Less noise and more emphasis on this word comparing to the all sharp f8 picture. Well, so the softness on this lens is not always on the worse, bad side. All right, and final set. Just the same story. Softer at 2.8, sharper at 4, sharper at f5.6, and sharper at f8. Alright, and again, if we add a little bit of extra sharpening, the default sharpening, and at the same time, in this instance, the pictures really deserve the noise reduction. As you see, at higher ISO, let's see for the default color noise reduction. So you see the color noise is gone. There it is, the green dots and of other color and this. And we can also add around 20, oh no, 200, but 20% of noise reduction. So this is smooth. And if we turn off the details altogether, you see like this, and it smooths. All right, and let's do this for all our pictures. I guess it's going to do the same. I hope it worked. No, it didn't. All right, let's do it again. Luminance 20% and color the default. So just using a little bit of the noise reduction and sharpening, you can get quite decent picture quality from this lens, even on APS-C, but of course it's much better on a lower resolution full frame camera. So you better use this with Canon 5D Mark I or Mark II. Well, I hope it all clears up everything for you. If you have any questions, just leave them in comments down below. Let me see. Right, a little bit less noise, but a bit of grain. Okay, if you have any questions, leave them down below, and my name is Kretz. Consider subscribing because we're going to be probably reviewing more lenses, and probably I'll do a review on a 5D Classic one day. So anyway, thanks for watching and have a nice time.